Hi, this is Paul. Viewer sent this video to me just out quite recently and caught my attention very much along the same lines of Douthit's Decadence book, of the commentary I've been doing on Eric Weinstein's videos about Peter Thiel. Now, my Eric Weinstein commentary, it seems, has led to his boss and a number of viewers on the channel. I know very little about Peter Thiel. I'm learning a little bit more as I look at more and more of his stuff. A number of the channel viewers regularly comment that Eric is a dimmer reflection of his brighter boss. They tell me that Eric is smart and interesting, but Peter Thiel is a better communicator and has more interesting ideas. And so I watched this conversation with Eric Metaxas a couple times, and I did find it very interesting. I'm not going to do a full treatment of this video. There are a couple more videos I want to see of Peter Thiel before I get too deeply into him. But I should say something about Eric Metaxas. I've got a complicated reputational relationship with him. In other words, I don't have a personal relationship with him. I've got a reputational relationship with him, and it always sort of borders between love and annoyance. Eric converted to Christianity and has told his conversion story a number of times. I've been aware of him for a number of years, and partly in relationship with Tim Keller and Redeemer Press. And some of you who watch my videos know that I have high regard for Tim Keller and Redeemer Press. Eric Metaxas is a comedian, and the presentation that he gave at the National Prayer Breakfast with Obama a number of years ago I thought was a really pretty amazing speech. On his radio show, though, he's sort of a conservative ideologue Christian pundit. And those of you who watched my conversation with Matt Miller and have watched a number of my videos sort of know that when things get a little too tribalistic, I get uncomfortable. And Eric Metaxas often sort of sounds like a tribal warrior. And as an author, his book on Bonhoeffer, I'm not a Bonhoeffer scholar, I'm not a Bonhoeffer expert, but there were parts of that book that sort of read like Christian propaganda and hagiography, and a distortion of Bonhoeffer as a rather complex neo-Orthodox thinker in the middle of the 20th century. Neo-Orthodoxy is a complicated, is kind of a complicated, is complicated. Neo-Orthodoxy is complicated. And if you don't know what Neo-Orthodoxy is, or Karl Barth, or any of that movement in the early middle of the 20th century to try to respond to theological liberalism and get back to some sort of respectable Christianity in a secular age, if you don't know about it, don't worry about it. It's, in many ways, its day has sort of passed and has been passing with the main line and has not stood up well in the main line to the ascent of critical theory ideas that have really possessed a lot of mainline churches. Peter Thiel wrote a book, 2014, which I just picked up and I've been doing some listening to, 0 to 1, Notes on Startups and How to Build the Future. And in that book, he represents this idea, which Eric has been talking about, which has gotten into Ross Douthat's book, that there's two types of progress. There's vertical or intensive progress, doing new things, versus horizontal and extensive progress, copying things that work. And in this interview, Thiel basically says that this decadence that Douthat has been talking about, that Eric Weinstein has been talking about, is all kinds of horizontal or extensive progress and not enough vertical or intensive progress. Don't want to let this occasion go by and not note again axial age geometry or geography. This is something that I remember Jonathan Peugeot tagging Brett Weinstein. There's a little video you can find out there of Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot and Brett Weinstein at a conference, and all three of them are talking. And every time Brett uses the word higher, Jonathan Peugeot tags him and says, higher? You know, you're not, what are you talking about? You are employing, you are appropriating from a world that you're at the same time dismissing. And that's one of the ways that Jonathan Peugeot really keeps conversations honest. And part of what's sort of drawn me to this conversation, this topic of conversation with Douthit, Weinstein, and now Peter Thiel, is that progress is a word that feels decidedly fudgy. And for the last 2 Friday mornings, 10 o'clock Pacific time, I've been doing live chats on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server. And, you know, continuing to, those chats I often find helpful because I get a lot of different ideas and perspectives from folks on the Discord server who are working out their stuff. And, you know, fudgy, what do I mean by fudgy? My use of the word fudge is fudgy. It's basically that there are multiple lexicographic meanings floating under a word, and we're using them in a sort of ideological manner or a tribal manner in order to score points, and we're not necessarily clear or high resolution or honest by the use of a word. And it's a word in a sense that we're not really big enough to wield. That's sort of what I mean by fudgy. We're sort of like a grade schooler with an assault rifle. And yeah, we can do some damage, but we can do some bad damage too. And that's sort of what I mean. I haven't done a Words That Fudge video for a while, but who knows? Who knows what the future holds. Now, some of you know Sevilla King's channel. She's on in this little corner of the internet. She's had a conversation with myself, with Jonathan Peugeot, with John Vervaeke, and with others. And she's been working on Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and this idea of quality. And it's very much a part of this conversation that quality or value is the question of what quality or value is. How can we know it? Can we wield it? This is all very much part of the conversation. And Sevilla, for those of you who didn't watch my conversation with her, she's also a clinical psychologist and has a lot of experience working with these ideas. And so on her channel, she works through them, especially using the work of Persig and Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and Lila to sort of work through these ideas. Now, she picked up on the video that I did, my revised commentary on Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris debates that I put out a couple of weeks ago. And I was really happy she grabbed onto the idea that I expressed in that video, and I'm altering it a little bit here now, that one way of understanding what religion is that religion is the JPEG of being, capital B, as Jordan Peterson would use, in sort of a Heidegger sense of, in some ways, Heidegger uses his word being similar to what I would use the word God. Now, I say that with some caution, but it's not completely disconnected. And so why we use religion is because, again, and you can go back and you can watch, I'll put a link to Sevilla's video here, because I think she really nicely lays out a lot of what I say. And that way you don't have to go through the much longer video that I put out. But religion, now when I say a JPEG, for those of you who don't know, is a picture compression scheme that's been around a while, and it's so used and popular because it's become so ubiquitous, and it's so handy. Now, if you know anything about compression schemes with audio or images, a JPEG is a lossy compression scheme, and what that means is that data is lost when you take a much larger high-resolution picture and compress it down into a much smaller file. One of the big takeaways I got from Jordan Peterson with his videos was this language, which I hear other members of the IDW use, lower and higher resolution. I don't know if that began with Jordan Peterson or someone else, but JPEGs can be very low resolution compressions of much larger digital image files. Now, my argument about religion is that, again, pulling in a lot of fancy Vervaeke language, again, one of the great gifts that John has given this conversation is an increasingly understood and used vocabulary by which we can begin to communicate with each other about, John Vervaeke has been giving us JPEGs to use that we can have conversations about some of these things surrounding the issues of his channel, meaning, the meaning crisis, cognitive science, even though, of course, I'm a pastor, I'm not a cognitive scientist. But religion is, in a sense, a way to bring something down to low enough resolution so that we can actually grasp it and work with it. We can get our minds around it because the world is just simply too big. And this is also sort of where my ideas of God number one and God number two come in, because, in fact, again, as always, your comments on YouTube and in the Discord server and in your conversations with me, your comments help me. Last video I talked about, the God of the gaps, that we imagine that God is somehow confined in this gap. And I said, no, God is behind it, and our scientific ways of explaining things cover up God, but God isn't reduced into the gap. And someone in one of the comments said, yeah, God is like the table beneath the jigsaw puzzle. But again, to go back to Vervaeke's stuff, but God is infinite. And so that table just keeps going. And our jigsaw puzzles are finite. And in fact, I love that image of piecing together the puzzle, because we might find some things that interlock, but part of how science works is that the resolution keeps going. And so even the pieces of the puzzle are low resolution, and they're even disconnected from lots of other things out there, and the table just keeps going. So when we see through the puzzle and see a gap, well, these gaps are themselves scalable and fractal because of the infinite nature of the table. And so what religion is a network language economy of communally agreed upon values, symbols, terms that together create a coherent, imaginary whole or worldview. And I don't use imaginary there in any sense as, well, as opposed to real. And again, look at my conversations with Brett Sockled about this, because the substance is more real than oh gosh, this stuff is so fudgy. We're using words we can't wield, but we don't have any choice. We have to, as John Vervaeke says again and again, we have to use the grammar the only grammar we have. And so it's always wanting, and it's always less. And so Sevilla talks about value, and so value sort of fits into that. And so again, I like this. I thought of it this morning. Religion is the JPEG of being. But how do we orient? And this is behind a lot of my recent videos. And this is where really Chesterton comes in, and I'll read a little bit more from that chapter in his book Heretics. It touches on so much of my work, and some of, Sam Harris imagines that we can know the good and the bad objectively. There's a fudgy word. Even though his take is nearly completely subjective. And so the illustration that he uses with Jordan Peterson is, well, you don't need to have a whole picture of the universe to know to take your hand off a hot stove. And of course, Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein answer back, yeah, but there are, in the grand scheme of things, time when you put your hand on the stove and leave it there and endure the pain for some other greater good. And in some ways, that image encapsulates the deficiency of Sam Harris's argument. You know, you might understand that, you might refit the metaphor and say, you know, you don't need a great scheme of things to respond to the prick of a needle. But if you're getting a tattoo, you sit there and endure the needle for the sake of the tattoo that you've now paid perhaps a lot of money to have someone to administer to your skin. It might be wise, it might be unwise. I personally have no tattoos because I can't even pick out clothes to wear, never mind a tattoo that stays with me like permanent clothes. So I tell my daughters this and they roll their eyes, but whatever. But this is the issue, that no, it's not just, and what is more subjective than getting a needle prick or a hot stove? Now humanism, which I find them sneaking Jesus through all the time with their humanism, they're smuggling Jesus with their humanism right away as abstracted Christianity. Again, see Glenn Scrivener's conversation with Tom Holland and look at the work that Tom Holland has been doing. Humanism as abstracted, low-resolution Christianity stripped of its historical particulars. Now, one of the interesting parts of this video with Peter Thiel and Eric Metaxas is when they get into these questions of interiority or exteriority, and I'm not quite sure that's the best way to approach it. What we're dealing with is in many ways, again, the expression, the difference between the one and the many. In what way is getting into a little bit of Platonism here. In what way is the idea of apple more real than any given apple? And in what way is any given apple more real than the idea of apple? And this is where, again, you get into issues like, why the church has been dealing with this question, eat my body, drink my blood, and what on earth does that mean? And in fact, in the Discord server this morning, had a conversation, a Roman Catholic deacon from North Dakota, who I hadn't met yet, I apparently just started following my work, probably caught on to me after talking to Brett, talking about, what we were talking about, communion and the Lord's Supper. Those of you who watched my conversation with Eric and Mark and Noel, my local pastors, Eric, who's got in some arguably the most sacramentalist of our churches, is not having communion while we don't meet. And there's something profoundly right about what Eric is doing. And it reveals a good insight into the very long conversation that the church has had over sacramentality. And again, those of you outside the church might listen to this and say, well, that's just this in-house conversation. What it actually is taking this multi-millennium long conversation, even connected with Aristotle and Plato, and applying it to people who will never learn any philosophy. And in many ways, if you want to understand what religion and the church do, it's exactly that. And Sevilla quite rightly noted that, philosophy and religion, well, in some ways, philosophy is sort of religion, but again, all of these words are imperfect tools for doing the work we need to do. And this, of course, gets down to, politics like religion is a way that these ideas come closer to home, because religion is always and politics is now, and sometimes emergency is immediate, where everyone will set aside politics and you can sort of get the temporal. They're all related and deeply enmeshed, but in terms of the moment, I just did a sermon on diachronos, diachronic ideas. Time is monkeying with this stuff. And so Jordan Peterson comes along with his maps of meaning and basically asserts that experienced meaning is an internal gyroscope of value. You know, why would the USA and the USSR put being? See, being isn't exactly God, because I would argue as a theist that even if nuclear annihilation happened, God would not be threatened. Okay? Maybe someone well-versed in Heidegger could clean that up for me. Why would the USA and the USSR put being in jeopardy over matrices of economic and societal principles? And that launches him into this quest. And it's interesting that then Sevilla very much sees it as a quest for value, and very much understands Persig and the art of motorcycle maintenance within this conversation. And what's been so interesting about Peterson is that Peterson triggered this among Christians, among non-Christians, among Buddhists, among many, many people. Peterson got something deep enough right that he triggered a wave. Now, there are other elements of that wave too. It wasn't just Jordan, because of course Jordan had pretty much been doing the same thing for a very long time and had not triggered a wave. And so this is where the man and the moment find each other in Bill C-16, and everything is, as astrologists would say, the stars were aligned and whoosh, it happens. But it became the YouTube clinical psychologist who relieved people of their nihilistic depression simply by watching his videos. No small feat. Became the YouTube clinical psychologist who led a whole generation of people back into the church, which is, of course, what drew my attention. That wave caught my eye, which launched, of course, the work that I've been doing, and people struggling out of the meaning crisis and finding in the church an ancient, especially if you're going to the Orthodox Church, very ancient way of dealing with the meaning crisis from within the church. Now, Rebel Wisdom just released a video, and actually Sam mentioned it in my conversation with Sam and Hank and Bruno, and I hadn't watched the video yet. And I did watch the video then after I had that conversation with them, and really appreciated that video. And I thought, John Vervaeke can sometimes be so esoteric no one can understand what he's saying, and Rebel Wisdom can, as a whole channel, can do that sometimes too. But I thought John was really powerful in that video, and I thought John was super helpful in that video, and some of the other speakers too really benefited from it. But I also noticed that, and this isn't a knock against David and Ali, because I generally care and have a lot of respect for them, but sometimes I get the sense when I watch their channel, now I've been on it, James K. Smith has been on it, Buddhist leaders have been on it, but there's, in the West, there's sort of this fear of the dog, let's call it. I mean, Sam Harris has an outside fear of the dog, but Christianity is just a touchy thing in this, and I think part of that is due to the God smuggling. And again, if you go back and you listen to the video that I put out, I think it was Wednesday. I don't have the date. The long video where I treat the Doubthet Eric Weinstein conversation. You know, Eric's complaint about Jesus smuggling is a very real thing. And it's a very fair thing. That Christians, everything for certain Christians is just a setup to get you in the church. And perhaps that's one of the sources of my discomfort with Eric Metaxas. And Eric Weinstein quite rightly objects to that. You know, we don't want any philosophical waterboarding here, at least not on my watch. I want to have a conversation that is respectful and honest. I would far. So one of the people who came to this church as a result of me very soon after I got here was the one, I've told the story before. My son was playing on his soccer team and didn't know what I did, and so we got to know each other. He lived just 4 or 5 houses down from me, and he learned I'm a pastor, and he had grown up in Los Angeles in Black Baptist churches, and he said, I know what pastors are. Pastors are kingdom builders. They build their own kingdom. What's funny about him, he's a very successful man. What's funny about him is that he always gives me a hard time because I don't sell the church well enough. You know, why aren't you out there always inviting people into church? And it's like, I'm not going to name his name, but it's like, this is what you hate about pastors, yet you want me to do it because he loves this church and he loves the people, and he gets frustrated because, you know, part of the reason I'm such a failure as a pastor, if you equate being a successful pastor with growing a church, is that I don't sell. I don't sell enough. That's probably some truth in that, but if you come to church, I want you to come to church for your own reasons. Now, I got into it a little bit with Luke on the Discord server today, sort of about this point, because he kind of made the point that Jesus is perfect non-coercion. And that's not really the Jesus I find. And so none of us fully exhibit the diverse excellencies of the Christ. And so there are certainly multiple shortcomings on my part. And so perhaps I could sell better. And so my wife complains that I don't ask for money enough, and my friend complains that I don't prod people into coming to church enough, and my deacons complain that I don't tell the people in church to tithe enough, and I'm too non-coercive for a lot of people's tastes. But so all of this is a very roundabout way of saying I can very much understand Eric Weinstein's complaint about Jesus smuggling. But the West they've been bit by a dog, and they're a little dog shy. And a lot of Christian dogs have done a lot of biting, and so it's understandable. But just an observation. Well, I'm not going to play a lot of the video, but I want to play the piece of the video about progress.
You say we, meaning human beings, are the only ones who can invent new things. Talk a little bit.
Now it's important, and I was a little unclear on this, but again, this is why I read the comments, and I try to get to all of the emails, and so if I've ever missed your email, please forgive me, and the diligent usually get rewarded. Thiel is a Christian. Someone said he goes to a Lutheran church, and later in this video identifies as a Christian. And there's a video out there where he has a conversation with N.T. Wright, and I forget who the third person is. But it's on Veritas Forum. So
about that idea, if people have read the book, invent new things. Talk a little bit about that idea. If people have read the book, they know it. But you know, the vertical and the horizontal that you refer to in the book as a principal thesis of entrepreneurship.
Well, yes, I believe there's I outlined two basic ways that we have progress as a society, and one is what I describe as horizontal or extensive growth, which involves copying things that work. And this is most evidently seen through globalization in the last 40, 50 years. And then the other one is sort of intensive or vertical progress, doing new things. And this is sort of iconically seen in technology or new inventions or things like that. And I think these are two sort of modalities of progress that I contrast. And I think for those of us living in the United States, Western Europe, in the advanced countries, my claim is that the second is much more important than the first. Globalization is perhaps good if you're in Burkina Faso or in China or places where you have a lot of catching up to do. It's not how we're going to improve living standards in the West.
Now, when you, again, I do so much chasing rabbits, it's easy to forget what the video is about, even for me. Progress. Improve standard of living. We use these words as if we all know what we're talking about, or that we're all in agreement about what we're talking about. And I would argue that we very much don't know either of those. And so it's worthwhile to explore it. So on some hands, we can look at, well, how much money do they have? And that's fair. I mean, it's not that we know nothing of what we're talking about, but there's a difference in there about knowing exactly what we're talking about, knowing nothing. We're in that fudgy, mushy middle. And this, of course, is where the work of, I can't think of his name right now, from Harvard, where his work, how the world is getting better, and Jordan had a conversation with him. When I can't remember a name, it's almost always because there's another name that's in that space, and I know that other name is wrong, and I can't push it out until a minute later. Our brains are so weird.
When you say globalization, just to be clear, when I read that in the book, it wasn't immediately clear to me what you meant. And in case there's anybody not getting that, you mean, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, that just to sort of spread what we have, right? In other words, not to take what we...
And everything I said about Eric Metaxas, I also have an issue with the use of intelligence as kind of an idea of value, and we hear that a lot. It's very common in our culture. Metaxas is a plenty smart guy. He's a graduate of Yale. You don't do what Eric Metaxas has done if you're dim. And so he's a very sharp guy, and he knows how to pay attention.
We have in the West and the best of the West, and to get it into every corner of China or any part of the world. That's what you mean effectively.
Yeah, I mean in the standard sense. I mean, it means all these different things, but it's basically sort of homogenization of the world, convergence. Things becoming the same. When you describe the world as the developed and developing world, that is a globalization narrative. The developing countries are the ones that are going to become developed by copying and converging. And then it's also an anti-tech narrative, because the developed world is a place where nothing new is going to happen. It's developed, it's done, it's finished. And this is very different from the way we would have described the world 50 years ago, when we would have described it in terms of the first world and the third world. And the third world was permanently screwed up, and the first world was the one that was technologically advancing. And so we're living in a world that is extremely pro-globalization, that has bet everything on globalization, and that is not at all that excited about progress in other forms. And my underlying thesis is that we've had relatively little progress in technology, broadly defined, in the West in the last 50 years. There's perhaps been a narrow zone of progress around the world of bits, computers, internet, mobile internet. Even that we can get into debates as to whether it's positive or negative, that you sort of alluded to a little bit in the intro, and I'm not trying to take you up on that, but but certainly.
I just said that because I don't care.
Metaxas is funny.
Certainly, most engineering
And he might be that. Not that, in fact, might be the highest compliment he could receive.
fields were bad fields for people to go in the Western world in the last 40 or 50 years. If you didn't want to become a mechanical engineer, chemical engineer, electrical engineering was already on its way out when I was at Stanford in the late 80s. And certainly, if you were so stupid as to become an aeroastro engineer or nuclear engineer, that was a bad idea, a full stop for the last 40, 50 years. And
Now, again, that's really fascinating. Later in the conversation, he's going to talk about the recession of the Christian language of calling. Now, one of the interesting things, now, there's a lot of reasons why Peter Thiel is an interesting guy, and I'm going to talk about that towards the end of this video. But in this conversation, he talks with Metaxas about sort of the waning of God's call. Now, when I was in college in the 80s, part of the thing is that I'm just so weird. I was different. But as a student who led Bible studies, went to church, because even though I went to Calvin College, a good number of my friends and roommates and hallmates, they didn't go to church. I went to church. I went to church because I wanted to go to church. And so what sort of gets set up is this, can be this very interesting little obsession about, I want to find God's will, and I'm going to answer God's call. And with Calvinism, this gets very interesting because, of course, the assertion is that calling to the ministry is no different from being called to be a plumber, and you do all for the glory of God, and that's very deep within the Christian Reformed Church and our tradition, even though many people in the Christian Reformed Church don't believe it. But he and Eric talk about the fact that this has sort of passed. Now, I didn't look at Eric Metaxas' age. Peter Thiel is about my age, a little bit younger. It's very interesting how many people I'm doing conversations about were born in between 1960 and 1965 or 66, in the early 60s. I just picked up a book actually talking about some of that. I pick up too many books. Where was I going with this? Oh yeah, and here he says, you'd be an idiot to have been those kinds of engineers, and I completely understand what he's saying about it, but that, in reference to later parts of the conversation, is sort of interesting.
And I think I do think that a lot of the challenges and problems we have in our society is that we are no longer progressing as fast as we're often told.
Now part of the difficulty, and I want to be really careful here, and this is why I don't really want to do an in-depth treatment of this conversation until I see a few more conversations of Peter Thiel engaging with different individuals, because maybe unfairly I'm a little more reticent to pass judgment on Christians than I am on Sam Harris, and that could be something sinful about me and something sinful that I've done. So Sam Harris, if you're watching, forgive me. I hope to be fair. And I'm not always fair. I get carried away sometimes and say uncautious things. And some of you like me being uncautious. But I want to be a Christian in this world means, Jesus says no one can serve two masters, God or mammon. Being a Christian in this world means almost always being torn between two masters. This, in fact, is part of the reason Paul, in the book of Corinthians, says, well, it's better if you're not married, because, in a sense, what he's pointing to is that being married means, in my case, having to take responsibility for providing for a wife and children. Now, it's a modern age and my wife can earn her own money, blah, 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 but I still take that seriously, especially when my wife and I have had 5 children, and so do the math on how many months and years she has devoted to her life to just giving our children a start, and we homeschooled. So, yeah, I On one hand, I try to serve the Lord. On the other hand, I got to put food on the table for the family. And so when I listen to Peter, I'm thinking through that. I'm thinking about that matrix. And especially in this part of the conversation, when he's basically saying, you know, if you became these kinds of engineers in those years, you're just out of luck because of the way those industries went.
You make this case really strongly, and I was just staggered by, I don't mean to cut you off, but you just make this
He cuts off everybody.
statement in
And so do I. It's an East Coast
the
thing.
book that
My whole videos are about cutting people off. Except they can't protest because they're not here.
in a way, since 1970, we haven't progressed much. And when I read that, I thought, that's the first thing I want to ask you. In other words, when you're talking...
And I thought Douthat's book makes that case very strongly. And because when I first heard this from when Thiel was on the portal with Eric, they made that point, and I thought, is that true? But when I read Douthat's book, Douthat made the point strongly. And this is going to get into, okay, what is progress? Well, it's along the backdrop of decay. And of course, you know, I have this phrase, the age of decay. Everything is decaying. So if you actually want progress, you not only need to hold your own, you not only need to improve slightly, in a sense, and space travel keeps coming into these conversations, you need to achieve escape velocity to get to a different level.
Talking about not much happening in 50 years, I sort of get it, but tell us what you mean by that, and at some point you can bring up Apollo 11 and Woodstock as you did last night, because it was a very fascinating way of framing the whole thing, I thought.
If anybody knows if they recorded what they talked about last night, I looked on the Eric Metaxas show videos, and I didn't see that, so I don't know if it was a private thing or what.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying there's been zero progress in the last 50 years, but you know, outside of the world of computers, there's not been much. And if you were, you know, the main function of our iPhone seemed to be to distract us from the way in which we're in subways that are 100 years old, and the ways in which nothing in the rest of the world has changed or progressed very much. And if you look at you know, cars or houses or things like this, haven't changed that much in the last 20, 30 years. Maybe 70s were still a little bit different, but it has not. It's not progressed very much at all. There's, you know, I think there's a meta level of question you could ask, which is that, you know, in science we measure Avogadro's number, the fine structure constant in physics, to many, many significant figures. But the question of the progress of science, how fast it is progressing, is it accelerating, is it decelerating, is it relatively stagnant, never gets asked. And if it gets asked, we get nothing but short propagandistic answers from, let's say, university presidents who will tell us, using adverbs and as a substitute for thought, that clearly and demonstrably science is progressing faster than ever before. I think it is instead rather stuck. And we can go through sort of any of a number of places where things have fallen way short of expectation. Nixon declared war on cancer in 1970. It was going to be defeated by the bicentennial by 1976. So we're, you know, fast forward 50 years. We're presumably 50 years closer to curing cancer than we were 50 years ago, but the expected time has gone up quite a bit.
Well, you can't forget that LBJ declared war on poverty in 1965. So that was really meant mainly as a joke.
And nobody laughed.
But when you say that Nixon, I really have to say I'm hugely fascinated by, I mean, you are a science guy, and so I want to hear more from you about this, because when we think of, we were talking about this last night, the Manhattan Project, the Apollo Project, put a man on the moon, those were times when people came together and accomplished extraordinary things. There's just no way around it. And obviously, you know, since then, you're right, we don't seem to have done anything like that. But is there really nothing we can think of? I mean, would the Human Genome Project at least impress you a little bit?
A little bit, although I'd say it fooled me a lot, since you know, I thought it would translate it into all sorts of cures by now, 20 plus years later.
Right.
And so you know, there's always sort of a question how this actually translates. And we can, I think even if we say that things are progressing at roughly the same rate, I think that they're slower, they're objectively slower. Life expectancy is not going up anymore. This would be like one way to measure progress in medicine is how fast is life expectancy going up. Last 3 years it's actually been going down, which is, like even someone as pessimistic as me would have never predicted that it actually would go backwards, because surely, we might progress more slowly.
It's scary. That's scary to hear that.
And I think one of the things there's sort of the failure, the question, why has this happened, or what changed, what went wrong, is always a little bit overdetermined. But certainly one cut on it is that big science is something like an oxymoron. And when you make it big, it stops being science. We have probably about 100 times as many people today in the world or in the United States who have PhDs in the sciences as in 1920. If progress was happening still at the same rate as in 1920, you would infer that the productivity of the average scientist is 99% less than it was 100 years ago. And I think it's even worse than that. So one partial history I would tell of what happened is that we had sort of a decentralized, healthy, scientific world before the New Deal. And it was heterodox. It was science as discovery, not science. I always think you have science as discovery, which is sort of the science one now only reads about in children's books on Einstein. It's sort of like a creative person thinks of new things. And then there's science as governance, where it's sort of, you're a robot in a lab, and that's what you do. And most of science is science as governance, not science as discovery.
So what?
And so part of my history of what happened is that in the 1940s, with the Manhattan Project, it was possible to take this pre-existing healthy system and accelerate it one time only. The New York Times, I'm going to paraphrase this, but this was about 4 or 5 days after the Hiroshima bomb. The op-ed in the New York Times was, hopefully this will silence the sort of conservative and libertarian people who said that the Army could not ever direct scientists and just tell them what to do, because the Army has proven all these people wrong, and hopefully they will now be quiet, because they were able to get a new invention to the world in 3.5 short years of the bomb, that if you'd left these prima donna scientists to their own devices, might have taken them 50 years. So now I will say the New York Times doesn't write editorials like that.
It's helpful to remember, especially in the context of the atomic bomb, that there's the science and there's the technology. And what the production of a bomb is really the implementation of technology. Now, these two things aren't exactly distinct, because you learn things. This again gets into some of the different kinds of knowing, the 4 Ps of Vervaeke. Having Niels Bohr or other physicists, chemists understand how a bomb might be built is very different from actually building and then testing the bomb and then using the bomb in wartime over a city of people. Those are all different things. Where does science fit in?
Anymore today. And I think part of the history is you were able to accelerate science one time by pouring money into it and scaling it. But then it came at the price of completely corrupting the institutions. It still worked with NASA and Apollo, but at this point, it is all just a slow bureaucracy. It's peer review, never have any heterodox ideas, and you have you've created a very large monoculture, which is pretty unhealthy.
So
that's sort of one cut of what happened. It was the government was able to accelerate it, and then at the price of destroying it forever.
There's so much here, but the basic thesis, I have to say, it startled me. I thought, I haven't thought very much about this. I think you mentioned in the book that jetliners, in the 60s, everybody can jump on a jetliner and we can go 650 miles an hour, and today, if anything, we're going slower, but we're certainly not going faster. And for sure, as a kid, I was sure that we would have flights to the moon, or at least that planes would be able to go 2,000 miles an hour or something like that. So I get it when I begin thinking about it, but I guess my question is there anything we can do? Is this the same problem we have with growing government? Is this just part of what happens in a free culture? Is that entropy causes you to become less and less free unless people are really vigilant about understanding how freedom works?
Well,
it's interesting in his question what he would mean by freedom and the role freedom plays in. See, what I like about this talk is that it very much gets eschatological, which I think is important for a talk like this, because a lot of talks have sort of eschatology lurking around the corners, but they don't really get at it, and these guys are getting closer after. Now, like I said, I'm not going to go through, although maybe in another video I will. It's Friday. It's Friday today, and what that means in terms of my pacing some of these weeks, I record a video on Friday, I record my rough draft, and then I record a video from my channel on Friday, and then on Saturday I'll release the rough draft, and then Sunday I usually only release a video on the church channel unless I get together with Freddie, which I'm not doing obviously because of the COVID. I'll release a Freddie and Paul show on Sunday usually. Those are usually pretty short. And then Monday, I like to have a video ready to go Monday morning, so you've got something to listen to whenever you listen to your videos. But religion is the JPEG of being. How do you talk about something as massive as the future? Well, you do it religiously, because it gets compressed into religion, and you use symbolism. Streets of gold. Lion will lay down with the lamb. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. The city foursquare. It's hard to imagine human beings today that don't think of progress, and on the back of Tom Holland, I would argue that's because of Christianity. But how do you talk about it? There's such massive summaries. I mean, we use illustrations, and when Metaxas asked Thiel to illustrate his assertion about decadence and a lack of progress, we can name things, but are those illustrative? These are just points. This gets into, just both how amazing and limited what we do really is. So the evaluation is too massive. The math is too massive. There's no ruler large enough to chart progress. Sam Harris's reducing it to subjectivity without realizing it illustrates the point. I, though I am small, am the largest thing I know in my own view of the world. I was listening to something talk about the Middle Ages, and in a sense, human beings got so small in that discarded image that part of what happens in the Reformation, or the Rebellion, I was talking to that Roman Catholic deacon, part of what happens in the Reformation is that human beings get large again, and that's sort of a function of what comes out of the Renaissance, of Renaissance humanism. And again, even the word humanism can be pretty slippery. Religion is the JPEG of being. God is the word you're looking for. God number one, the earth is full of his glory, and value is very much mixed up in that. God number two, you cannot engage with it in any other way than acting as if it is an agent. And this is where, as agents, you must deal with the agent and arena as one whole, being itself. Now, so then progress, we're assessing progress without that value yardstick. And a word that comes off often is health. And we use it rightly because it helpfully contrasts with decay. Now, again, this is just a little bit of a paragraph from that chapter in G.K. Chesterton's Heretics. A modern morality, on the one hand, can only point to absolute conviction to the horrors that follow breaches of law. And it's interesting, again, that Sam Harris uses the example of hand on a hot stove. It's much more difficult to realize the healthy hand. I often say of some things, good administration is what you don't see. In my conversation with Hank and Sam and Bruno, we talked about the fact that American supply chains had gotten so good that toilet paper was always in the stores. And unlike the Soviet Union, the store shelves were almost always stocked. And it was only a disruption that might cause a glitch in the matrix, to borrow some Rebel Wisdom terminology, to borrow stuff from the 1999 movie Matrix. A modern morality, on the other hand, can only point with absolute conviction to the horrors that follow breaches of law. Its only certainty is a certainty of ill. Jordan Peterson, suffering is for Jordan sort of that base reality you can't escape. Now, John Vervaeke in his series challenges that, and I think makes a very strong challenge. But again, notice how suffering plays in Jordan's system. It can only point to imperfection. It has no perfection to point to. And once Chesterton points this out, it becomes awfully hard not to see. But the monk meditating upon Christ of Buddha has in his mind an image of perfect health, a thing of clear colors and clean air. He may contemplate his ideal wholeness and happiness far more than he ought. He may contemplate it to the neglect or exclusion of essential things. He may contemplate it until he has become a dreamer or a driveler, but still it is wholeness and happiness that he is contemplating. He may even go mad, but he is going mad for the love of sanity. But the modern student of ethics, even if he remains sane, sane from an island dread of from an insane dread of insanity. And Chesterton continues to make this point in that chapter, and I read more of that chapter in a previous video. And one of the nice thing about Chesterton are his books are in public domain, so you can get them, you can find them for free on the internet, you can get them for dirt cheap on Kindle, you can get them very cheap in paper copies. That's something that's really nice about Chesterton. But his point here is, so we talk about progress and we say, well, cancer was supposed to be cured by the bicentennial, and I remember the bicentennial, and it wasn't. And airplane, well, it's gotten more efficient, and it's, we've sort of been biting at the edges of it, but we're not. I remember as a boy, the Concorde, the supersonic Concorde was going to be the next jump where you could, so I grew up in the New York metropolitan area, where you could travel from LaGuardia or Kennedy, I think they flew out of, where you can travel out of Kennedy to London in, 3 hours. Have your sonic boom over the sea. And the Concorde was a disaster. And people loved it, but economically it didn't fly. Sorry about that. Yeah, we have a sense of that progress has been retarded. But again, as Metaxas showed, tough to get our minds around. And with enough illustration, we begin to get a sense, oh, look. Now, of course, with the COVID, there's a clamor that, now our lack of progress is exposed because this wasn't supposed to happen. Sort of, again, like the Trump campaign that I think it was Aaron Sorkin points out to his daughters. But this idea of health is itself quite slippery. Who is more healthy? The athlete is more capable, but the athlete has already started to decay in a way the infant has not. The infant is more vulnerable, but has a certain quality that perhaps the athlete has not. And so all of these words are slippery, and none of them sort of bring us clarity to where we want to go. Now, Adam Friended had a tweet today, which I found very interesting. I just attribute it to the Holy Spirit, but this tweet caught my eye, my salience. I can use the Vervaekean scheme too. And a little video, about 7 minutes. I'll put the link in the comment section, or down, not in the comment section, but down in the notes. Life and Death and Undeath of American Comics. Undeath. Isn't that interesting? In a sense, this video was making an argument of decadence. Now, maybe it's my salience landscape that I see decadence everywhere now because that's what I'm paying attention to. And I've been reading Taleb, who makes the point that, yeah, this confirmation bias, it's a powerful thing, and this is the bullshitting that Vervaeke warns us about, and the rationality we should use to try to avoid the bullshitting, and on and on and on. DC and Marvel have never been more profitable on the big screen, but it's all gone digital, and that side is losing money. Their main business is in the dumps. Now, this comic book fan says, well, a lot of it's because, to them, progress meant go woke, go broke. They've all gone woke and nobody cares. And this is even while, and we've seen this dynamic in Star Wars. I saw a little video clip of the women who are now in charge of the new Star Wars scripts. And of course, the other side on the internet is saying, it's done. Maybe it will be, maybe it won't. But some of the more recent Star Wars movies, even my children, who are more woke than I, didn't like the Star Wars movies. And it's like, I understand sort of the IDW types who do see that and say, oh, cursed critical theory and Marxism, bloody postmodernism in my videos. But my wokish children? Interesting. Picked up this article quite a few years ago, 2011. I used to pick up a lot of good stuff out of Tim Keller sermons. This was a piece by Edward Docx, D-O-C-X. And again, the link will be in the notes. And there's the link there, Prospect Magazine UK. The apogee of postmodernism pop, though, is of course Madonna. She is Marilyn Monroe at one moment, Marlene Dietrich the next. She is sadomasochist, virgin material girl, wearer of the cross. She is the iconoclast, feverishly invoking iconography. The eternal shapeshifter obsessed with her own body. The image maker, she is brilliant, she endures, and she is a terrible actor, a clumsy and effortful dancer, and an unexceptional singer. This is, of course, when Madonna was still around. She's not around much now. The age of decay comes for us all. The overstyling celebrity from scratch, and of course there are many, many Madonnas around today. The overstyling celebrity from scratch, the referencing, the collating of images, the intensely self-conscious mediation with the audience, the whole stop making sense while making something about sense itself, that's postmodernism. And of course, Rebel Wisdom's program is deeply right there. Sense making. Eric Weinstein, Daniel Smachtenberg, IDW, it's all right there. So now let's turn with a little bit more confidence to the quagmire of sociology, politics, and philosophy. Decadence not only in the institutions of the academy, but the subject areas themselves. Baudrillard, Derrida, Foucault, and so on. Postmodernism first appeared as a philosophical term by the book The Postmodern Condition, 1979, Jean-Francois Lyotard. I can't speak French. Sorry, Canada. Sorry, Trudeau Sr. The French thinker. Lyotard drew upon Wittgenstein's ideal of the language game, which points out that different groups of people use the same language in different ways, which in turn can lead to their looking at the world in quite separate ways. Maybe this is the source of the fudginess I perceive on language. So, for instance, the priest might use a word, say truth, in a very different way than the scientist. And Brett Weinstein gets chided by his fans for his metaphorical truth. Can't you use another word besides truth? Because we've cordoned off that word for our propositional world. For instance, the priest uses the word, say, truth in a very different way than the scientist, who in turn would understand the term in quite a different way to the policeman, the journalist, the philosopher, or to the artist. In this way, the notion of a single overarching view of the world, a dominant narrative, or to use the jargon, meta-narrative, vanishes. There is no single narrative, no privileged standpoint, no system or theory that overlays all others. Perhaps the enduring insistence by church people of their narrative is what makes so often church people and their churchiness something to be avoided, not just the Jesus smuggling. This influence of narratives is the essence of postmodernism. Lyotard was an adherent of Marxism, one of the most potent meta-narratives of the modern age, but he turned his back on Marx. In this way, now, Jordan Peterson would think perhaps the exorcism wasn't complete or the transformation wasn't complete. In this way, the origins of postmodern thought can be seen as, in part, a rejection of the totalitarian impulse, also, and not coincidentally, at its most powerful in the 1920s and 1930s. Sadly, 75% of the rest of the stuff written about postmodernism is nonsensical, incoherent, self-contradicting, and otherwise emblematic of the crap that has consumed the academic world of linguistics and continental philosophy for far too long. But not all. He's writing again in 2011. There are two important points. First, that postmodernism is really an attack not just on the dominant narrative or art forms, but rather an attack on the dominant social discourse. In other words, we've got to tear everything down, right? Critical theory, it's got to be torn down in the name of justice. Well, justice is the thing we ought not to deconstruct. Or my oppression is the thing I ought not to deconstruct. The suffering, again, back to Chesterton, the suffering, that's all we know, is my oppression, my suffering. That's the firm foundation upon which I will build the justifications for the program I promote out in the streets. All art is philosophy, and all philosophy is political. And the epistemic confrontation of postmodernism, this idea of deprivileging any one meaning, this idea that all discourses are equally valid, has therefore led to some real-world gains for humankind. Because, after all, they had some points. These certain ways were not their certain ways, and there are always thumbs on scales. But because once you are in the business of challenging the dominant discourse, you are also in the business of giving hitherto marginalized and subordinate groups their voice. And from here it is possible to see how postmodernism has helped Western society understand the politics of difference and so redress the miserable injustices that have hitherto been ignored or taken for granted as in some way acceptable. But again, relevant realization, which combinatorial explosion, lions and tigers and bears. You would have to be from the depressing religious right or an otherwise peculiarly recondite and inhuman school of thought not to believe, for example, that the politics of gender, race, and sexuality have been immeasurably affected for the better by the assertion of their separate discourses. The transformation from an endemically and casually sexist, racist, and homophobic society to one that legislates for and promotes equality is a resonantly good thing, no question. So Edward Doc's not about to question that, at least not in 2011. Jordan Peterson won't rise for another 5 years. The second point is deeper still. Postmodernism aimed further than merely calling for a reevaluation of power structures. It said that we are all in our very selves, we're getting close to the meaning crisis here, nothing more than the breathing aggregate of these structures. It contends that we cannot stand apart from the demands and identities that these structures and discourses confer upon us. Adios to the Enlightenment. See you later, Romanticism. Instead, it holds that we move through a series of coordinates on various maps, classes, gender, religious, sexual, ethnic, situational, and that those coordinates are actually our only identity. Now we're barking up the tree of pilgrims versus tourists. Rod Dreher. We are entirely constructed. There is nothing else. And this, in an oversimplified nutshell, is the main challenge that postmodernism brought to the great banquet of human ideas, because it changed the game from one of self-determination, Kant et al., to overdetermination. Did you hear Peter Thiel use that word? I am constructed, therefore I am. But here we come at last to the trickiest question of all. How do we know postmodernism is over, and why? Let's go back to the arts. We're tourists now, not pilgrims, because we can't see the stars. We can't navigate by the stars because the stars are cut off. We might say, well, natural law. So yeah, Carl, I'm thinking about you. Natural law below us. Natural law leaves us with not too much better than dead reckoning, because are we really simply trying to go back? At heart, natural law can't give us progress, because nature's law can really finally only tell us what has been. Now, you might dip your should in there and say natural law can say what should be, but that will always be returning back. And what we're finding, and what I hope to get into, and if I do more videos on this video, is that there's both always a return element to these and a progressive element to these narratives. So let's go back to the arts, the front line. It is not that postmodernism's impact is diminished or disappearing, not at all. We can't unlearn a great idea, but rather postmodernism is itself being replaced as the dominant discourse and is now taking its place on the artistic and intellectual palette alongside all the other great ideas and moments. In other words, we know the ancient, we know the Renaissance, we know the modern and the Enlightenment. Now we know the postmodern, but who is we? Well, I'm the constructed self. Well, I'm constructed by history, but so I might have a meaning crisis, or I might say, nuts to the meaning crisis, I'll just create, and I'll wish that there's a secret, sacred self down below that's somehow energizing me because I can wear that cloak and make the story work. In the same way as we all have our little in the same way we are all a little Victorian at times, a little modernist, a little romantic, and so we are all and will forever be children of the postmodernism. This in itself, of course, is a postmodern idea. All these movements subtly inform our imaginations, which are somehow just floating out there, and the way we discuss, create, react, and interact. But more and more, postmodernism is becoming just another one of the colors we might use. Lady Gaga uses it, for example, but Adele does not. Or, to switch metaphors, just another tool in the artist's kit. Why? Because we are all becoming more comfortable with the idea of holding two irreconcilable ideas in our head, that no system or meaning can have a monopoly on truth, but what we still have to render, but that we still have to render the truth through our chosen system of meaning. Let me read that sentence again. Why? Because we are all becoming more comfortable with the idea of holding two irreconcilable ideas in our heads. Sam Harris and his patch between the scientific and the manifest image. And Brett leaning into him and saying, Sam, this is incoherent. Sam's deeply postmodern in this way. That no system of meaning can have a monopoly on the truth, but that we still have to render the truth through our chosen system of meaning. So the postmodern challenge, while no less radical, somehow feels less powerful to us. We are learning to live with it. For a while, as communism began to collapse, the supremacy of Western capitalism seemed best challenged by deploying the ironic tactics of postmodernism. Over time, though, a new difficulty was created, because postmodernism attacks everything. A mood of confusion and uncertainty began to grow and flourish until, in recent years, it becomes ubiquitous. A lack of confidence in the tenets, skills, and aesthetics of literature permeated the culture, and few felt secure or able or skilled enough or politically permitted to distinguish or recognize the schlock from the not. And so, sure enough, in the absence of any aesthetic criteria, it became more and more useful to assess the value of works, the value of works according to the profits they yielded. We could no longer see anything because the overarching meta-narratives were gone. So what's left? Money. And again, look at that video on the comic books. So sure enough, in the absence of any aesthetic criteria, it became more and more useful to assess the value of works according to the profits they yielded. Capital, as has been said many times before, accommodated all needs. So paradoxically, we arrive at a moment where literature itself has become threatened, first by the artistic credo of postmodernism, the death of the author, and second by the unintended result of that credo, the hegemony of the marketplace. What then becomes sought and desired are fictions that resonate within the widest possible public, that is, with as many discourses as possible. This public can then give or withhold approval measured in sales. Now, what will be interesting in COVID is if this, in fact, shakes postmodernity with ideas that perhaps ingesting Lysol or somehow getting the sun into my lungs, or Scott Adams says that was Trump playing a game. And today Trump says he was being sarcastic. And Scott Adams says he's still playing the game. So which movie are we seeing? Where's the overarching narrative? Where is the measure by which? All the way back to Chesterton at the beginning of the 20th century saying, it's only the avoidance of pain. It's only the avoidance of death. Christianity stripped down to humanism. It's only the avoidance of this. But here's what happens when ideologies, even humanism, get stripped down. Again, Jordan Peterson's ideologies are crippled religions. Some of the paralysis that I think we talked about in the video with Hank and Bruno and Sam is Christianity not only elevates the value of human beings, but also relativizes it against other values. because human value isn't worth everything unless there's something to die for. And that's what Christianity does. So Christianity not only gave value to humanity, these aren't lives we're going to throw at the Great Wall, but also relativized it and said there are things greater to live for than just human life. Well, how can we find those things? We find them in narratives. We find them in narratives about life after death. Dave Rubin just did a conversation with Michael Shermer, and Dave Rubin then sends out these little teasers, and one of them was evaluating Jordan Peterson. And in that, Michael Shermer sort of accentuates Peterson's mythos in understanding the resurrection. And fair enough, Sam Harris backed Jordan down to almost certainly not about Jesus walking out of the tomb. But the recession towards the mean, which Brett was supposed to keep them from, I suspect Jordan will continue to go back to his openness, where he wonders just how powerful can mythos be? Just how powerful is this over the materiality? I mentioned in the Discord conversation today that on Unbelievable, Daniel Dennett debates some Christian, I don't remember the Christian, and when Daniel Dennett talks about reality, well, there's matter and information, and when I heard him say that, I laughed out loud, because the information he's thinking about is information that colonizes matter. Information, value-laden information that shapes the world according to certain things and not according to others. Jordan's openness, well, again, we certainly hope Jordan is doing well and can participate in these conversations again. It'll be interesting to see what the trough after the wave has done with Jordan. The market as God, or my little self as God? The market's a lot bigger and a lot more powerful. Now, Peter Thiel, I mentioned in my last video, is part of the New Black Republicans. And now what do I mean by the New Black Republicans? These are gay men who are openly gay, married gay. And what's interesting about Thiel, and this is sort of where my confessional conversation about gay marriage meets my other videos, because, well, who wouldn't like to have Peter Thiel in your church? First question the pastors are going to ask is, does he tithe? Now, Milo is a mouth. Peter, we tend to take much more seriously, partly because of his money, partly because he's clearly a much more serious individual. He's on the board of Facebook, but what's interesting about Peter is that there's some Trumpism about him. Well, what do I mean by that? Not only did he go to the Republican convention and endorse Donald Trump from the podium of the convention, and again, his status as a gay man didn't hurt the Republicans too much. His status as a gay man doesn't mean that Eric Metaxas doesn't want to talk to him. Well, this is where, there's been a lot of disruption and trying to figure out where the lines are. But yet, just as Donald Trump one day will say from the podium, I'm the president, I get to decide who opens where, and what. And the next day says, well, we leave it up to the governors and things, and then liberate Michigan and Minnesota and Virginia. And then when the governor of Georgia says he's opening up, Trump says, hey, not so fast. And when life's all supposed to disinfect the lungs, see, you don't drink it, you inhale it. Please don't inhale Lysol. And Scott Adams says, no, it's Trump being Trump at his most geniusy. And at his most geniusy, or how can you tell? We're in lands where what is up and what is down and what is progress and what is regress and what is corruption and what is decay, and how can we know? And so the member of the board of Facebook is speaking against the cathedral or the citadel. Well, board of Facebook is about as powerful as it gets in certain realms. So, and then when a little later when Metaxas makes a quip about his money, Thiel says something that he realizes it's not that much money. And I think compared to the guy sitting in this chair, it's a lot of money. But so again, we're in the realms of the postmodern, and we're looking for the stars to guide us, and we don't know what to do. And the disorientation that Chesterton says, we only know the pain when we feel it. And at a certain level of money, you stop feeling pain, and everything up of that is just up. Taleb says some very interesting things about money in The Black Swan. And he wrote a business book. Followers wish to follow in wealth, while saying money isn't where the value is, so where is the value? Of course, the most interesting thing in the Douthit Weinstein video was the conclusion, where Eric smuggled Jesus in. He brought him right in the front door and said, I just can't help wonder if Jesus were alive today, what would happen to him? Could Jesus be nullified with the memes? Well, don't forget, they cast lots for his clothes. Well, what does that mean? That one garment he wore, which was one long seamless thing, and the soldiers officiating at the executions, crucifixions can take a while. Oh, we shouldn't split this up between us. Let's cast lots. Where is the value? Where's the value that we recognize? And the reason Jesus is valued, and the reason wealth in the church is almost always seen as abdication, and the reason that monasteries that said no to wealth grew fabulously wealthy and then were robbed by the iconoclasts of the Reformation. Well, the 5 deaths of the faith in Chesterton's Everlasting Man. We come round and round and round, and so spiral dynamics, perhaps. Spirals are really interesting combinations of round and through. Where is the value? Where is the value? How can we find it? How can we know? Do we follow the money? Yeah, that'll teach you something. But progress. Can we know it? Can we see it? Does it look like decadence? Will a pandemic shake it out of us? Well, I don't know. Why not smuggle Jesus here at the end of this?